Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Impact STL's Spring Panel Unhoused in St. Louis, Reasons and Reality. Together, we will spend the next 90 minutes learning from experts who have worked extensively to both understand and address the evolving needs of the St. Louis unhoused population. We hope this discussion will help raise awareness of the challenges our unhoused community members face, as well as illuminate the critical action steps and volunteering opportunities that can help bring homelessness to an end in St. Louis. At any point during the discussion, we encourage you as the audience to participate by posing questions to panelists and sharing their ideas as well. The unhoused population of St. Louis faces a daily struggle to meet their most basic needs. Combined with steadily increasing housing prices, the global COVID pandemic, and the end of the eviction moratorium in July 2021, the number of unhoused individuals in St. Louis and across the nation continues to rise. Shelters have been increasingly strained, prompting local organizations to set up temporary housing across the city. Gentrification continues to push individuals with lower incomes and lower socioeconomic status out of their previously owned homes, leaving both their housing situation and future uncertain. In addition to housing inequities, fundamental issues such as proper access to nutrition, healthcare, and other social services remain to be solved. Many organizations are currently short-staffed and working overtime to aid and advocate on behalf of St. Louis's unhoused citizens. Progress has been made, but much remains to be done to ensure STL's unhoused population has access to the basic resources they need and deserve. I am now honored to welcome our four panelists who will help expand on the current issues surrounding homelessness by sharing their valuable work and unique insight with us this evening. First, we welcome Tim Huffman. Dr. Huffman is an associate professor at STL, whose research focuses on developing optimal communication and organizational strategies for social justice initiatives centered around homelessness. In addition to his work as a teacher, he also serves as the director for Stand Up for Kids, an organization dedicated to providing mentorship and community resources to homeless youth all across the country. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Huffman.
Introducing all of us, or should I talk?
Yeah, you can.
Do you have any initial comments?
Yeah, you can introduce.
Yeah, my name is Tim. Hi, welcome, or thank you for your welcome. I am a professor at St. Louis University, and I actually know most of the people here on this panel. Part of my work is just to connect community to engage in questions that help create new futures. And so I serve on Anthony's program committee and his board of directors as an example of the kind of work that I do. And I'm excited to answer questions today.
Thank you. Next is Anthony D'Agostino. Anthony D'Agostino currently serves as the CEO of the St. Patrick Center, a community organization that provides unhoused individuals with housing, food, and the fundamental resources and support they need to be successful. He also serves as the chair of the board for the Continuum of Care, a membership body that promotes systems to end homelessness once and for all. Please join me in welcoming Anthony D'Agostino.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a great introduction. I really don't have much more to add, except I actually didn't know Tim, I forgot Tim was going to be on the panel, and he's my boss, so I'll keep an eye as I move forward and answer questions.
Red light.
Next is Bill Kren. Bill Kren is the founder and current president of Assisi House, an organization that converts community spaces into affordable, supportive community spaces where individuals are treated with dignity and supported during their path toward independent living. Bill Kren has been a servant of homeless outreach for the last 35 years and was named Volunteer of the Year by United Way of Greater St. Louis, the St. Patrick Center, and received the Mildred R. Dunn Award for his service to those dealing with mental illness. Please join me in welcoming Bill Kren.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. I hope to be able to share some of the experiences and developments that we've been part of over the years, and I really look forward to the questions. Thank you. And I'd also like to introduce
No, yeah, go ahead.
Drew Keely is our program director for volunteer engagement for the CC House, so he's anxious to talk to you about that also. Drew, you want to say hello?
Yeah, I've just been, recently with my work at CC House, I'm working on looking for volunteers working for finance, so I'd like to talk about how that system works and the successes we've found with that.
Well, we'll just jump into our first question. So this is for all of our panelists. Approximately how many people are currently unhoused in the St. Louis community?
I mean, it depends on your definition of unhoused. There are different definitions that we apply for someone who's couch surfing and young. The educational system will treat them as unhoused versus your couch surfing adult HUD won't consider you unhoused. So it kind of depends on HUD is the Housing and Urban Development. Thank you. We should play an acronym game where we have to put $1 in every time they say an acronym. Yeah. So the federal government has different standards for young people versus adults. That being said, what was the last point in time count in St. Louis? 1,200. Yeah. 1,200. 12 to 1,500 is how many adults or young people living in HUD's definition of homelessness that we find each year. Now, that's what we find, so understand that we don't get everyone. How far we miss that mark, it could be as much as 1,000 more people, but it would probably be more than that. So between 1,000, hello, yeah, between 1,000 and 2,000 people.
Well said. Anyone want to guess if we have, let's say, 1,500 here in St. Louis? Anyone want to guess how many are in LA? How many people are considered unhoused? 65,000.
Yeah.
Sorry, you said that. You gave it away. So over 60,000. So they're hovering between 60 and 70,000. We hover between like 12 and 1,500. Pretty big difference. Obviously, very contextually different places, but I brought that up just to tell you that this is I wouldn't say solvable problem, but we can definitely take a big bite out of this problem here in St. Louis. It's achievable. The 60 to 70,000 mark is much more difficult. So, we're not New York, we're not LA. There's pros and cons to that. The biggest pro is that we can actually solve some of these issues.
I don't have too much more to comment on that, other than the fact that so much of the housing population is, and Tim's point earlier, there's a lot of people that we miss out there. Yourselves, walking around the streets, you see pockets of people there, pockets of people there, you see people on the roadsides. It's just, there's so many others that we don't even have awareness of. That if you do some of the night patrols or winter outreach type of things, you discover all these hidden pockets of people that are out there in the community.
Yeah, or staying in abandoned houses. It's hard to get a number, but that's roughly what it is.
Yeah. So what are some of the environmental or socioeconomic factors that make someone more susceptible to becoming unhoused?
That's a great question. There's so many variants that could come into play with answering that question. I think that, estrangement from family is a big one. Mental illness is a huge one. Substance abuse is another large one. Those are multifaceted factors that come into play, and sometimes they're intertwined. Substance abuse or criminal activity certainly enters into family relationships or estrangement issues. So there's so many more.
Please. I just had a quick question.
Please, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned mental illness. What is the landscape like for different resources that unhoused populations can reach in St. Louis for mental illness while they're
That's a very good question. There's a number of agencies throughout the area, and there's a coalition of agencies, I believe, also that address providing resources to people with mental health issues. I know St. Patrick's Center is a huge one, and this is to coordinate that, safe and places for people. I don't know if you've heard of that organization. They provide, mental health services and resources for people to get to mental health services across the community. I'm sure that, it's been,
So I have recent data on that. I was in a focus group yesterday with a variety of health providers, and they estimated that they could refer 20 people a day and that there's no space for them. So yes, we do provide space for them. But I mean, you probably, after referring 20 people a day, would run out of people at the end of the year. You know, you would eat that number down over time. But it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Yeah, we're not great at providing substance use disorder treatment, mental health treatment, behavioral health treatments. Not a thing we're strong at. To speak to the kind of broader question, I want to start by saying that in some ways, all of us are a little bit homeless. And by that, I mean, all of us, because we live in a temporary universe full of temporary objects, the things that shelter us are temporary. And so any formulation that shelters you could go away, right? That this building can be ripped away from us. And so in pure matter of fact, even the wealthiest person on the planet has a small degree of housing insecurity, because it is possible that some succession of events could strip away all of the securities that keep them sheltered. We're not like turtles. We don't have like houses on our bodies. We live far away from the environment that we sort of evolved to be okay in without shelter and clothes and all of the other technologies that we use. So when you say, what are the factors that lead to homeless? I would say, well, I mean, think about your own life. What are the things that contribute to your housing stability? And it's diverse. It's your relationships, it's your work, it's your physical health, it's your ability to make wise choices. It's your connection inside your community. It's the availability of the parts that you need, right? Another thing that I'll say, which is a much less fancy way of saying it, is that particularly in a city like St. Louis, racism is a huge part of it. And when you look at the different kinds of racial inequity that undergird all sectors, every single one of them also bends towards homelessness. If it's harder to get a loan in a black part of town, if it's harder to get housing from a racist landlord, if you're more likely to have the criminal justice system treat you poorly, you start adding these things up, it accrues a really significant confluence of social justice issues. So much so that St. Louis the population is 50-50 white and black for the city. And the homeless population constitutes 75% of the population, which, to do that math differently, you're 3 times more likely to become unhoused in St. Louis if you're a person of color. Now, that's not to say that all of the other things aren't also the case. But I think that, those are my 2 things.
Yeah, well said. It's interesting to start getting into the numbers and into dealing relationally with the people who are experiencing homelessness currently in our city. And there's actually a little over 80% of the individuals we run into are episodically homeless, which basically means that they fell into a situation within the last about a year, maybe, that healthcare related issue, maybe there is a substance abuse issue, something else that occurred, and they spiral down into a place where they have no housing anymore. Only about 10 to 20% are chronic or are really dealing with homelessness on a long-term basis and have been homeless for years and several times. So it's interesting to start thinking about not only homelessness start to dig into the different types of homelessness. And what we've been running into, what I've learned over the last couple of years, especially with COVID, is start thinking about how many people, if we were to offer housing, how many would come in out of the cold or off the streets. and how many wouldn't? And if they won't come in, why? Like, what have we set up that is a barrier to them coming in and finding just basic housing? And I think that's something that St. Louis needs to grapple with, and other cities have done a little bit better at talking about the intricacies of why people are not only homeless, like Tim and Bill have been talking about, but then also how do we solve that problem and how do we meet people where they're at? Because it's not as simple as just saying, here's a place to stay, right? I mean, if I gave all of you in here the same basic option of place to stay, a lot of you would be like, I'm not staying there. I'm not interested. I don't like that place. I'm not allowed to bring my own stuff. I mean, that's where the shelters are right now. Most shelters, you can't bring your stuff with you, right? Most shelters, they have significant rules that say you can't stay there, you have to come and go as they tell you. They don't have the freedom that you and I have, right? So we need to start digging a little deeper into how to solve this problem. And, oftentimes when you think about homelessness, it's myopic. It's like just thinking about one thing and just give them housing and then solve the problem. It's much more complicated because human beings are obviously very complicated.
Scott, a couple things to add to that. One is the fact that there's two major events in our history, in our recent history anyway, that have dramatically exacerbated the homeless situation in St. Louis. One is the deinstitutionalization of the mental health hospitals in the past, that was in the early 70s that happened. So a lot of the people that were in these institutionalized settings were thrown out basically on the streets to fend for themselves without the resources that they needed to find housing. And there were several organizations that started popping up to address that need. But when you take a person that has the instability of mental illness and then turning them out on the street to try to fend for themselves, that's a completely unfair situation. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is in terms of development, that this also happened in the 70s and early 80s, is the redevelopment of the Central West End. There was a demonstrated focus on closing down rooming houses. Rooming houses had low-income opportunities for people to get houses that were much more amenable to their needs. They didn't have to take care of yards, they didn't have to take care of, clean up the kitchen or the living room or anything like that. And the room that they could go to and depend upon that would cost them very minimal in terms of that. And that demonstrated focus on closing down those rooming houses sent a lot of people on the street. So low-income housing and opportunities for people with very little housing skills just disappeared almost, over the next 5 years between 75 and the early 80s.
Next question.
On the topic of how we frame this issue, what are the disadvantages, if any, of framing the condition of homelessness as a behavioral issue or failure of personal discipline? Are there ways we can more effectively communicate the issue of homelessness to the public?
So, one of my favorite studies looks at housing availability relative to people in different socioeconomic brackets. So there's a few concepts in June, One is the idea of being rent burdened. I mean, we all kind of get what that means, right? I'm paying more money in my rent than I can afford for how much I make. And if you look at the national level and you take people who are in poverty, under the poverty line, and you look at the housing that they can rent and not be rent burdened, there's roughly one house per person. But if you cut the number in half, so basically everybody in poverty, so you got the top half of people in poverty and the bottom half of people in poverty. If you look at the bottom half, the ratio between units that they can rent and not be rent burdened and people is 1 to 5. There are 5 times more people who could rent something, just couldn't be a lot, than there are places they can rent. Well, guess what happens when you can't afford to rent anything? you are homeless, right? So that's an example of an economic thing, right? It's naming the housing market. I mean, and if you think about it, why would you want to waste your time as a landlord with small margins when you can have bigger margins? Why wouldn't I want to, knock it down and build something else and make more money per unit? So you can understand the economic motives of the people who are organizing in that way. But anyway, that's an example of an alternate frame. Another thing that I'm absolutely disciplined about is thinking about substance use disorder as a medical condition. When someone's like, oh, are most people addicts? I'm like, yeah, okay. If someone calls themselves an addict, I will call them an addict. But if someone does not call themselves an addict, it's mental. It's a behavioral health issue, and it stems out of untreated medical issues, right? The other story that I like to tell, recognizing moving away from like a behavioral or a character issue, is looking at homelessness as a consequence of labor laws and education. So if you are a 60-year-old man and your entire life you have worked in construction and you become disabled, if you are in a city where your disability social security can't afford rent, and that is many, you've become homeless. And I've met this guy a lot of times. Now, how on earth should we allow someone who's worked their entire life building things that other people live in be homeless? That's a fundamental violation of our labor laws. The people who exploited that person's body should be held accountable for the damage they did to them. And is incumbent upon our society to all people with disabilities able to be housed as a fundamental right, period. So those are a couple of alternate things.
I don't know if I can speak too much more to that. Personal responsibility, personal behaviors, those are all things that we aspire to. Our parents have called us to aspire to. And if you've got substance abuse, if you've got mental health issues, that's a very serious aspiration, very serious limitation to your aspiration of getting to that type of level where you can depend upon your personal behavior, your personal aspirations, a personal responsibility. And there's a lot of fragile people out there, and fragile people fall off the edge quite rapidly.
I'll just add one thing, and that's maybe to reframe this or just frame it in another context. You all probably remember, God, it was now coming up on like a decade ago, it was really in the news a lot when we talked about access to healthcare, right? There was Obamacare was coming into the frame. It was around the 2010s and into the 2014s, and it was just a big issue. And I think as a society, a lot of the conversation started hovering around whether it was a right or a privilege to access healthcare. And what I've learned is a lot of this conversation starts to delve into not this issue at all. It starts to delve into every one of yours or my personal beliefs. Like, what do I believe, right? So if you dig deep into not just the policy or what you're talking about or you're out with friends, start digging into like what they core believe about human beings, about what people deserve and their rights or their privileges. And if someone believes that housing is a privilege, this is a completely different conversation. It's hard to have anything past that if you're talking to someone who believes that housing is a right, right? So that is, I think, a fundamental idea. And we saw that come up with healthcare, right? So some people would say, no, it's okay if somebody doesn't have basic healthcare because it's a privilege you have to earn. It's meritocracy. It's something you have to deserve or people get and some people don't. Well, is there basic human healthcare? Well, for us, I mean, for me, it was, yes, a basic right. The same thing with housing. It does not matter what the individual we work with did or didn't do. We work with anyone who walks through the door, and some of them have done horrendous things. You are not what you've done by one act in the past. You are who you are and your being, and no one can take away that human dignity, and no one has the right to say that you don't have the right to basic housing, shelter. We as human beings all need to be sheltered. We can see what happens when someone is not sheltered. Like, it literally deteriorates someone's physical and mental bodies. The trauma you deal with by living on the street is massive. We have women who come through our shelter all the time, and because they are exposed on the street, the chance of them being raped goes way high. I mean, it's not human for us to allow people to be unsheltered on the streets. So it is a basic human right, and that's what we need to fight for. And once you get there and get people on that setting, we can start having conversations about what type of housing. Like, that's what I'd love to talk about. Like, what type of housing is the basic housing that everyone deserves? I don't know. I'd love to have that conversation, but if you're having that with a politician like I have, who believes that people deserve to be on the streets because of something they did in the past, we're at an impasse. Because I need to get them to where we're at, and that's actually where St. Patrick's Center, we're faith-based. Most of the politicians I talk to are also faith-based or Christian, and I try to meet them there and say, Christianity believes everyone has dignity. You can't take it away from them. And you can't argue as a Christian person, or a person of any faith, I would argue, that someone doesn't deserve to have basic shelter over their heads, right? This is biblical. So anyway, I know I'm getting into Tim's territory of esoteric philosophy of issues, but he's the academic. But it's just something for us to think about when you talk to people about this conversation. And by the way, you should be talking to people about homelessness, right? And another bigger issue to talk about on semantics, the word that's starting to come up now is houselessness, because homelessness is really getting into the core identity of a person and telling them they have no home. And that's not right. I mean, it's a house, it's a place you stay, right? It's not a home. So anyway, not to go into another tangent there, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak from a little personal experience, specifically about what Tim said regarding people who were would work their entire lives and were on benefits, and just how inadequate those have been in every situation I've seen to provide for them. You know, most of the people that get Social Security hover between like $600 to $700 a month, and I've been on the apartment search in St. Louis recently, and I can't find anything for less than $800 a month. So it's never been sufficient, and it continues to get more insufficient.
So I kind of had a thought I wanted to bounce off everyone. So you get, yeah, just bounce off you guys. Something I'm thinking about is, I think relative to other areas, people consider like the cost of living in St. Louis like pretty low, but also, you know, the amount you make, like the minimum wage is lower here comparatively. And I was thinking about, like, you know, obviously we should be treating housing as like a right, and we should have, like, going back to the ratio that we were talking about, an equal amount of affordable housing units compared to people who want to live in them. Like, that just makes sense. That's treating housing like a right. Whether or not we're going to define, you know, what kind of housing is suitable, that's a different question. But I was wondering, like, you know, you can raise the minimum wage, but landlords are always going to be feel like in our society by trying to improve their margins. So how do you establish policy that caps the amount, or maybe like sets a ceiling, or I guess a floor, like, on how much landlords can charge? Because if you raise the minimum wage and say, like, okay, well, now you can make $15, $16 an hour, so you can afford some of these like apartments, aren't the landlords just going to increase the wage, you know, like the amount you pay rent, because they're just looking, like, it shifts the market, right? So how do you prevent landlords from being moved by greed without like taking some really large political action and saying, like, okay, look, government, like, we're going to treat housing as a right, so you need to be able to make this affordable for people relative to the wage that they can afford on a day. Like, yeah, go ahead.
To piggyback off of that question, also, I know sometimes landlords will kind of target a more poorer section because they can make money off of evictions and not physical poverty. And so in line with that, with making housing affordable, also how do you prevent evictions? How do you make sure you can pay on time?
Nonprofit housing.
Yeah.
Is that your name?
Yeah. So let me start with a out of the box contrarian idea here that actually will make Tim feel like can't believe I say this, but let me defend landlords for a minute. Okay, so landlords, most of them, well over 90% of them are in it to make money. It's capital, right? It's capitalism. And that's their job, most of them. And so when rent goes up to meet a market because an area is either expanding, growing, giving a higher level area, gentrifying, whatever you want to call it, when they do that, they're just doing what pays the bills and it pays for their family. So I don't begrudge landlords for continuing to raise rent on our clients. I get it. It's the system. You have to change systems. You can't expect people to meet goals. You have to expect them to play into the systems of incentives and disincentives. So to get back to what Tim was saying, non-profitizing housing. We have to. I mean, I actually don't care what you call it, but you can't have a housing system. And I talked about healthcare before. Well, once again, you can't have a for-profit healthcare system if you believe everyone deserves basic healthcare. You have to create a different system, whether it's within the capitalized system or whether it's a separate system. I don't know, but you have to do something. Same thing with housing. Over 95% of housing in the St. Louis area is run by for-profit individuals or companies.
Probably 10. There are probably 10 people who run that 95%.
Yeah, and most, there is and it's a huge, well, it's like many industries, you have big developers come in and they take over housing and then they try to make as much money as they can on it. They're there for the profits, right? They're for profit. I get that. But as a system, we have to fight against that if we're trying to fight for the system. Once again, I guess we're in the business school, so we should talk a little bit about business. Capitalism is fantastic. It's great. I am a capitalist. But there are certain areas of capitalism or just in society that we have to protect from unfettered capitalism. And one of them is housing. Now, if you don't believe that's true, then this is a much more difficult conversation. Because how do we get a hold of the price of housing with this situation? We can't. I mean, I don't see it. If you guys have an idea, I'm all ears. Because we are looking for that all the time. The way we do it now is we ask the government for a percentage of each individual client that we serve's rent, and they pay it. But it can't keep up. So we're constantly fighting and trying to find more funding to keep up with the rising costs of $600, $700, $800 a month, and we can't keep up. So.
Just like to give you an example of some of what Anthony was talking about here. The CC House, we recognize that foundational change in availability of rooming houses. So we are actually in the process of setting up rooming houses. We've established 6 houses over the past 8 years now that address that need. So what we've done is we go during the winter time into a permanent shelter and then strike a lease with the landlord to turn that into permanent housing for those individuals after the shelter period. So they actually get a room, they got communal living areas, a communal kitchen, they've got communal other recreational areas and such outside. And it gives them the opportunity to get a room for much less than market rate housing. I think we usually charge $250 a month. And it's well within their means if they are able to find even a part-time job or if they get Social Security or disability benefits and such. So we've served over 150 people now by doing this over the past 8 years. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking. We're reestablishing rooming houses in St. Louis. And typically we find buildings like old convent buildings that are kind of set up for that type of residence. But unfortunately, the city also has several rules in place that make it very difficult to establish these houses. And we've been fighting that over the past 8 years. So in order to establish a house like that with different residency requirements that are outside of code, you have to get signatures of at least 50% of the residents within 500 feet, 500 circular feet of that particular building. And we've been successful at doing that, but it's getting harder and harder and harder to do. So we're trying to set up a engagement with the Board of Aldermen to try to change that requirement and allow us to have more clear access to developing those types of properties.
Yeah.
Do you see any possibility or like kind of working to kind of change those laws that you're talking about? So it's really for the unhoused community in your local government, and besides that, what other kind of legislation that it can are you trying to push for in the city government? I know in Barstow, how does the city government and the federal government work in conjunction with each other with funding, especially in the city?
By the way, the county is the worst.
Great question. So I think you started with like, do you have hope of changing?
Yes.
No.
Oh.
No, I'm sorry.
It's that bad.
No, it's a great question. Let me just tell you, it's getting worse and not better. That's the unfortunate piece. So you've all heard of maybe NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. There's a new term that's going out around there. I hope I get this right, but it's bananaism. Build absolutely nothing anywhere, not anytime. Like, so it's NIMBYism to the extreme. And we are moving towards bananaism here in St. Louis. We have half of our 28 aldermen have signed petitions saying they don't want anything related to homeless services built in any part of their ward, period. So this is becoming, that's never happened before. So like we're at St. Patrick's Center trying to create an intentional encampment. Now, we're not creating an encampment out of nothing. There's people already encamping, like in places just because they have nowhere to go. We want to go to those areas and create an intentional encampment and offer services and supports and try to get them into more permanent housing. Well, like I said, most aldermen now are saying, no way. I won't even have a conversation. So we're heading in the wrong direction. Now, where's the hope? We are continuing to have conversations with the current administration. I will say the current administration has put more money and emphasis towards trying to solve this problem than any other administration I've seen so far. There still needs to be a lot more done and a lot more emphasis on it, and we want them to push a little bit more social capital and political capital towards it. But we have in the city, for example, we have Corey Bush. She's a major advocate. She actually was homeless at one point in her life. She experienced homelessness, and Mayor Jones, like I said, their administration is heading in the right direction. It's never going to be fast enough for anyone up here. We like it to move faster, and the prevailing winds in the community is moving in the other direction. And as you all know, with politics, a lot of politicians have to go where the prevailing winds go. So I'm a little worried about where that takes us. But.
Well, yeah.
You asked a broader question about municipal governments and federal governments. But the answer, Anthony's maybe the best at giving this answer. It's super convoluted and complicated. The federal government does grant the city funds that are supposed to be spent in different ways. And the best way to think about that is just kind of think of like what the program types are. So there's some funds that are specifically designed for emergency solution, kind of short-term stuff. There's some funds that's specifically designed for housing or longer-term solution stuff. How that all works, I can confidently say no human within 100 miles of here knows all of the rules, or at least they don't agree with each other on how they ought to unfold. So that actually becomes a part of the problem too, right? It's not only about resource availability, but understanding how those things flow. I think something that is a commonly held belief of lots of folks who do this work is that over-reliance on the government to solve the problem is also part of the problem. And that is incumbent upon us to engage stakeholders beyond the city, beyond the state, and beyond the federal government, and develop assets and leverage strength in a way that Yeah, moves past federal and state and city level funding. Because they never, ever going to give enough. The dark part of it says the governments are only ever responsible for paying the least amount to prevent a complete upheaval of society. And that they only fund social services to prevent the revolution. And that when the revolution starts, they fund some more stuff. And when the revolution cools down, they fund some less stuff. So maybe I'm wrong, but you know.
I have a little more hope and I have a more positive spin on good governance and just like good leadership in any organization, whether you're talking about for-profit, nonprofit, municipal, government-run organizations. I mean, we have them. There's examples even in Missouri, there's examples of agencies, governmental agencies that are that have great leadership and are moving in positive directions. And so I think that we need to look to other places and try to figure out how our government and our municipal government, city, state, all those, we can actually start to work together. And it is a combination of working together, right? I mean, political entities want to keep on to power, so we do need to take away some of the power structure from them to make some of the decisions that could harm our clients. We've seen that in the past. And this could be a whole 90 minutes just on the past history of St. Louis and what's happened and how the government's been involved and the responses and everything else. But, you know, we can do this, and I'm hoping, I am hopeful and optimistic that, you know, with some of the new people in charge and some of the money coming down, maybe we can start to move in a positive direction, but we need the community to come along as well.
We're going to shift to discussing what actions are most useful to serving the populations. So, which interventions are effective in preventing homelessness? Which interventions are effective in providing aid and a path to self-sufficiency for individuals who are currently unhoused?
I think to speak to the model that we have in CC House, basically we encounter people on the street and through what's called the Winter Outreach Program. They go out on the streets in cold weather, severe winter weather to try to get people to come off the street and into sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent shelters that are available throughout the area. We've got several social workers that we engage with to try to link those people with our permanent shelter when we have that available, and then get them into the program. It's all about connecting in a way that's going to be palatable or acceptable to the folks that you're trying to get off the street, because a lot of times they've had very negative experiences with shelter programs. It was even temporary shelters, and I've worked in those. I volunteered in those types of shelters, and when you've got 150 people in a gymnasium on cots, and you can imagine the level of noise and activity that goes on overnight, you know, the snoring, the coughing, everything else that's happening. It's a and lack of storage. To your point earlier, you don't have a place to put your stuff. You know, you have to leave it at the door or hide it somewhere outside, and who knows when it's going to be there or not. You know, when you get back out of it. So, trying to find a way to connect people with ways that are going to be acceptable to them, so they don't have to worry about what little security they do have.
Let's play a game. So I want to think in terms of two vectors. The first is timeline, and the second is order of magnitude. So imagine that there's the immediate need, the shit we're going to do now. Imagine that there's some medium-term solutions, and imagine over here is long-term. This is a G. Okay. And then over here, I want you to imagine individual action, one-to-one relationships between you and another human being. And here, we organize specific nonprofit organizations, communities, neighborhoods, and here are policies, society-level policies. So there are, what, 3 times 3, 9 regions that we can imagine social action with respect to this stuff. So just take a moment of silence and brainstorm one, and then be ready to tell me where on this giant map it goes. Anthony probably can imagine 7. The St. Patrick Center is maybe 7 of those. Okay, take a moment, and then we'll brainstorm. And I'll take some from y'all first, to just get some program models on here. What is immediate, medium, or long-term, and what's it addressing? The individual, one specific, relational? Is it an organizational action, or is it a political action? What do we think? Yeah.
Like emergency shelters for the winter time would be now,
Yep. All right, so if I organize a shelter, it's meso because it's not just me doing something, it's an organization. And shelters do not solve homelessness, period, the end. They prevent worse things than homelessness, namely dying on the street. What's another one? Yeah.
Donating food and clothes.
Oh, really?
Really? I didn't know that. This is true?
What? Oh.
Wait, really? Okay. I'm
All
gonna
right,
go.
we're about to become homeless. Everybody's a little bit homeless.
Lesson right here.
Yeah, we're being displaced. So we got 5 at 5. Okay, so someone said donating winter items. Where's that?
Yeah, setting up winter shelters and then donating food and clothes. Bottom left and then middle left.
Okay, so this is shelter. This is most donations. Good. What else? If there was a third dimension, I would add social and material. So thinking about the ways that we connect with people around the material needs of their existence, but then also meeting them as full people who are like, you know, with souls and societies and emotions and all that. Yeah.
If you give someone like a couch to sleep on, that could be medium.
Yes, a couch surfing. Absolutely. Because it's not gonna last forever. So one who's gonna piss the other one off. What else?
The CCS program, maybe not so medium.
Yeah, so that would be like transitional housing.
Right.
Yep. So I'm gonna use the hard abbreviation, transitional housing, but it's defined, so we're fine.
Although we do have residents.
Which is long term. Yep. And so we typically call that permanent supportive housing or PSH. Okay. Okay, good. What are some other things? You haven't cracked the macro yet. Yeah.
Would you consider like calling your alderman or local government about universal housing like a long-term initiative?
What are you trying to affect? Policy?
Yeah, policy.
That's macro. Yeah, so long-term policy advocacy, right? So policies tend to follow. What else? Yeah.
So like short-term macro would be like a one-time government handout, for example,
Okay. Yeah, so go ahead.
like a stimulus check of sorts.
Okay, yeah. Harassing the city to, you know, open more shelter or, you know, some things like that. That tends to be a little bit more macro. You're organizing, there are people in our community who have been doing this so well, so long, that everything that they do is macro. Like Tekka Childress is just so successful at organizing that when she's like, I'm gonna call my friends, like she's acting across the entire sector. So I would also say that like what goes into this is sort of like long-term, you know, advocacy. Good. So giving us this as an answer to the question though, what are some other models that are effective responses? And the question is two-part, for preventing, but also responding to homelessness. What are some other things that we would add here off of like the common plate of human services?
establishing a much more thorough mental health infrastructure like this in the country.
Mm-hmm. And
That's
there-
more preventative approach.
yeah, and that's, yeah, so like health systems here, right? Yes.
I'll stay up there, top right. So places like, for example, New York require every development to have a certain amount of affordable housing. Something that St. Louis does not do.
Where's professional development go? Maybe here? Yeah, so, you know, I'm just gonna, to save myself the chalk with jobs, but this is all kinds of things, training programs, workforce development programs, equitable hiring programs. Something that I often think about is how are the jobs as we imagine them organized in ways that have certain presumptions about how many hours of productivity some people can have. If you could figure out how to make money off of people working 15 hours a week, there are a lot more people you could employ. Because there are just some people like that. My friend who is 65 years old and is a disabled construction worker wants to work, but can only be on the street so long. Right? You know, so this is not just, you know, like training people, but thinking really capaciously or broadly about how does we structure our jobs. What's a long-term micro action? I feel like the Assisi House is kind of modeled after this in some ways. But creating relationships with people, right? Having like a long-term relationship.
Mentorship.
Yeah, or just, I'm the faculty mentor for Labra, which is a student organization at St. Louis University. And they just go out every Wednesday with food and start conversations. And sometimes it leads to a referral. Sometimes it leads to advocacy. Sometimes the students, learn important things and go on to shift their careers and whatever. But I happen to think that like the soul of the work is often found here, right? Like how much you really know what you're talking about is like, do you actually talk to people at our homes? Do you have any relationship with people? I mean, we need policy wonks too, but I happen to think that we need to act, we just got into this on Saturday, we need to act all the way across this spectrum, right, in order to be a successful actor. Because how the hell do you know what policy to advocate for if you don't know the people's lives it's going to interact with, right? But like really, like sandwiches is your like solution. Random acts of, if we do not have random acts of evil that created society, right? They were planned. So it's not random acts of kindness that gets us out of it either. Yeah.
When we first started STL House, we had 4 young kids. It was like maybe 5, and it was like 7. And I just remember one day we were redoing one of the apartments, and I said, why do people like Black people? And I said, I don't know, what do you think? She says, I don't know what's the matter with them because he's my friend and I like him, and what's the matter with people, basically. And so finding a way to change hearts, I don't know where that goes on your thing, but, but we put our kids in that situation where they had experiences, and it's a hard thing to do sometimes, especially with your young kids.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to challenge myself to locate it on the board, and I would say that community building is part of what you're talking about, relationships and trust and like knowledge of neighbor. And I'm going to say that I think that it's kind of mezzo, and I think it's long term. But it's not just that there's a physical house, but also a place where you feel like you belong, right? It's both, so. is there the right number of bumps in there for all of them? All right, so I'm gonna stop dancing.
Well, I had a question,
Yeah.
not just for you or anyone on the panel, but anyone else. Like, where do you think, 'cause I have my thoughts, but I'd like to know what people think. Where do you think we do well in St. Louis, and where do you think we fall very short? Like, are there, we're not, I know this, we're not doing all 9 sectors well, right? But are there some places we're doing better than others, and why? Like, I think that's an interesting why question to delve into when looking at this visually.
I mean, we have really strong activists in the short-term space. Winter outreach, the church shelters. And because of that, I think that we don't do as good of a job on a macro level in the short term, because they've been relying on the macro mechanism. I think that our problems with affordable housing in the macro level are way easier than other places because of our housing. Although that's one of the last.
For our next question, are there unique solutions or circumstances for people who are chronically unhoused? And how can social services be utilized to help?
Sure. So one of the ways that the human service sector understands how someone should be responded to is based on the overall understanding of their vulnerability. It's not the only way of making decisions, but it's kind of our current model. And there are some flaws in the way we conceptualize vulnerability, particularly around racial equity. But I think that it's important when thinking about chronic homelessness is to think about the sort of degrees of vulnerability and the ways that people are vulnerable. Because in order to effectively organize, you more or less have to respond to all of those vulnerabilities comprehensively, right? If someone, for instance, is unhoused, but they also have housing-related trauma, you can't just give them a key and have them be housed. I know people who sleep outside with the key to their house in their pocket because their experiences in their home were so negative that being there is a trigger for them. Okay, so you can't just do the one and forget all of the rest. So if I know that they have trauma-related vulnerability and access-related vulnerability, I need to respond to both of them. So what are the degrees of vulnerability, or what are the arrays that exist around health, mental health, social insecurity, and profession-related dangers, like sex trafficking and things like this. Not sex trafficking, but sex work. What am I missing as far as vulnerability? Pretty much it. Yeah, so you need a program that responds to all of them, right? And you need it also because you're going to beat up your housing stock if you don't treat people's mental illnesses alongside, their housing needs. So, yeah, the other thing with respect to chronic homelessness, and this is just like a thing, is that like, if you've got 1 or 2 things that are majorly going haywire in your life, you might be able to get shit together in a year. If you have 5 things that are really, really, really going wrong, we cannot put a timeline on how long that person needs support. You just need to be open to that person may never be self-sufficient ever again in their life. And that we shouldn't have this like fiction that what they need is like a 3-month job training and then like a rental support for 6 months and like, boom, they're gonna solve their diabetes, schizophrenia, alcohol use disorder, disability. I mean, like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not a 6-month problem. So I guess I would say that is like you need a breadth of services and a commitment to the long haul.
Yeah, well, just to like talk about some of the terminology that we're starting to talk about. When you look at short, medium, and long term, short term in the industry, we oftentimes talk about, yes, we're sheltering individuals. We're also providing like quick transitions for individuals into housing. But medium term, you're starting to get into rapid rehousing, which is maybe 6 to 12 months, maybe a little bit longer. So rapid rehousing is trying to get that medium ground of individuals. And this all goes to acuity, like the need of the individual.
And that's rental assistance.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
basically me
but
getting
it
you
can't have,
into a
it
place.
can't have services around it. But, short, medium, and long term, when we're talking about chronic homeless, that's a long-term issue. And it's a long-term acuity individual. So you're gonna have people who, we have individuals within our PSH or permanent supportive housing model, they will never be able to be self-sufficient. They just won't. There's a combination of reasons why, but they're never gonna be in a position where we say, okay, we've worked with you for 2 years, like you're off on your own. They won't be able to create an income for themselves. They don't have enough of the ability to live on their own. They need people around them, right? So it's almost like you have to have in the healthcare world, you'd say it's almost like a nursing care model. It's a long-term nursing care model. And we build that for individuals who are chronically homeless. That's not everyone who is experiencing who's chronically homeless, but it's a definition. People who are chronically homeless are, basically for 3, 4, 5, 10 years have been struggling with in and out of being homeless or long-term being homeless for that long period of time. So there, as Tim mentioned, there's oftentimes not just 1 or 2 factors. Like if I fall into homelessness, oftentimes it'll be because I lost my job. It's because maybe I had a healthcare related issue, something happened, or maybe I do have a psychotic break and I go into homelessness. But we're talking about individuals that are dealing with 5 things all at once. And it's intensive, it's expensive. So this long-term solution, we don't want to most societies don't want to put up the money that it costs to actually start solving that. Really expensive. It's much easier to just put up like a smaller amount of money and deal with shorter medium term situations or lower acuity individuals. So,
Yeah, I'd like to give maybe Drew a little chance here to talk about the program that he's involved with, because we try to, the residents at our homes typically have issues that they're still struggling with. So even though they're attached to a more permanent housing situation, they still have issues that they need to work around. So can you kind of talk about the community program?
Yeah, so I would definitely speak to the truth of that it's never just 1 or 2 or 3, it's always several things that have been accumulating over the person's entire life that by the time they get to us that they're trying to address. And the accompaniment partner program that we started pretty recently is still pretty small. Basically what we do there is we just take each one of our residents, typically the higher needs residents, and we pair them up with someone in the community and just allow them to build a personal relationship, just give them each other's contact information to allow them to kind of not step outside like the social work, our role as social workers in CC House, but to get more direct and personal assistance than all social workers can give to all 50 of our residents at any given time. And I think that that's been with the small pilot program we've done so far has been really successful in just getting people to come out of their shells and really start thinking in different ways about what they are capable of, that they may not have thought themselves capable of in recent years. And also, I think the biggest part of it is just so many of our residents have become socially isolated, especially our older disabled residents. They won't come out of their rooms for a week or so at a time, which is obviously a horrible problem. So the accompaniment partner program, just having someone who might take them out to lunch or bring them a meal once a week, or just sit in their room and talk with them about movies or anything, has been really, really helpful for the few people that we've done it so far.
Are they open to it?
Oh yeah, everybody that we've talked to has been very open to it. And again, it's been pretty small, and we've kind of chosen the people that we knew would be open to that kind of socialization. But yeah, even the people that we've started talking to about now that we're getting more people, we were kind of more hesitant about it, tend to not want to talk to us, the social workers, who just most of the time keep to themselves. They've been really open to the idea of just having a way to get out of the house and people to talk to, and community to have.
When do people usually go to these little get-togethers, just on weekends, or just try to find a consistent time with the person, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's usually, I mean, it's highly dependent. We tend to just kind of leave that to them. It's usually, the people who have been most successful, the partners who have been most successful, it's usually just coming over once a week from weekends or after work or something like that. Or a lot of it is just, especially for our older and disabled residents, a lot of it is just getting rides to doctor's appointments for, one of our accompaniment partners has, he's a retired physician, so he's got a lot of expertise in that, and he's been really helpful for the resident that he's been paired up with, and just like making sure medication is on track, and just keeping up with him and having conversations with him about his health that the social workers just don't have that kind of expertise. And I think having a community connection outside of like our expertise and what we know and help them with, especially with the boundaries that our professionalism put on us, really bringing gifts or introducing residents to our families, and that kind of community is harder to do without breaking those professional standards. So I think that's also one of the really important parts of our company program.
One of our board members works at Edward Jones, and he's got obviously some financial skills, and he's partnering with several residents trying to increase their financial literacy and trying to get them engaged with banks and things like that. So trying to get them into savings programs. We've also started a wealth building program where we're going to, it's kind of like a 401k where if they start putting money away, we'll try to match their savings and help them build up a stable, financial backing that they can rely on if something goes wrong.
Sorry, what's the name of the organization?
Assisi House, like St. Francis of Assisi.
Got it, okay.
ASSI.
I was trying to spell it, and I was like, I'm having a rough time.
We actually have a website out there, so it's assisihouse.org.
I guess, how do you help someone who may not be as open to it or may not be as receptive?
That's a challenge sometimes.
That bottom level, building relationship is usually the most important piece. But there's a term that we use oftentimes internally is self-determination. In some organizations, I think most organizations try to meet, and we've talked about it tonight, try to meet the individual or the client where they're at, person that you meet on the street. So building that relationship, meeting them where they're at, and letting them help determine where and how they're going to be housed. We have individuals who we outreach on a regular basis, and they're not ready to come in from outside yet. And we just keep offering, we keep working with them and offering them different solutions and ideas. But once again, it can't be just a one size fits all model, because obviously people aren't like that.
Also, help is social. And by that, I mean, it follows all of the same rules. So like a gift is good, right? Ever been given gifts that you didn't like? In fact, there are all kinds of gifts that you could imagine that are super insulting. So like, I don't know, if someone gave me a book on like how to lose weight, what are you saying? Right, you know what I'm saying? Like, I got you a free coupon for a haircut, Tim. Like, thanks for that, right? And I'll give a fancy philosophical term. There's a process of interpolation, which basically means forcing someone into a subject position. So if you're walking across the street and a police officer says, "Hey, you," they like conjured you into a social space, right? You're now being yelled at by a cop. Now they might be ready to say, "Watch out for that car that's going to hit you." But the tone and the subject, it all matters. I was reading this story by this politician who was like, "I want to help homeless people. I saw this person and they needed boots. So I bought them boots and I rolled up and I said, here's the boots." And they didn't want them. These people don't want to help themselves. How about, "Hey, my name's Tim. What's your name?" Like that's way better than, "Here are your boots. Like take the boots." Like, what are you talking about? Right? And so sometimes people are resistant to help for all kinds of reasons. But sometimes your help is shitty, like bad help. Stop helping like that, right? And start asking people who look good at helping you, "How did you know to even do that?" "Well, I went on outreach with this organization. And then I talked to people on my way home. And over time, I learned the things that they needed. or they got enough trust in me to ask. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot more than like service visit. I mean, there are people, and part of the reason we resist services too is that if we've been failed time and time and time again, like I just don't want to deal with it, right? So
the help, or in your analogy, the gift that we oftentimes are giving someone has strings attached. So not only are you getting a how to lose weight book that you don't want sometimes, but the gift also comes with, well, I'm gonna give you this book and I'm also gonna tell you when you can read it, how you have to read it, I'm gonna watch you while you read it.
right,
It's like, screw that. I don't want the book and I don't want you in my life. Like, so, but almost all of our services have major strings attached.
Yeah.
Here's housing, but you have to join a program to find work. Here's housing, but you have to do this, this, and this. You can't bring your dog with you. You can't do this. You can't do that. The amount of strings that we attach to people, like, we would never accept them for ourselves, right? I mean, if someone came up to me and offered me housing, even if I needed it, like in my current situation, like, and they had all these strings attached, I'd say, screw that. I have money and I can do my own housing, right? I mean, but these are individuals, because they don't have something, we assume that we know better for them, and that also at Huffman times, like, we're the experts. So, I mean, on a daily basis, I talk to donors who come in and they have a great heart, they want to give, but they want strings attached to their donation, right? They'll be like, I just got a call the other day. Someone read something in the paper and they said, hey, I want to give you this amount of money and I want it to go to tiny homes. I'm like, okay, great. And I'd like to serve women with children. Okay. Well, now we have to try to figure out which programs we have, tiny homes programs, the women and kids. We have to start, and now it's starting to put those strings, and it's because someone thinks they're an expert more than we are, right? It's like, you know, me going into any field and saying, like, I know exactly how, you know, to invest my money, right? So I go into a ceremony, invest money every day, and I say, here's how much you invest your money. They probably look at me like I'm an idiot because I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not in the field. I'm not researching stocks all day. I don't have time. Like, I'm doing other stuff. Like, there's expertise that matters. And as society, oftentimes we don't have a large, we don't really care about expertise like we used to, which is unfortunate.
And then to let you to come back to them and report to them what kind of results you got out of the money.
Yeah. Well, and it's usually number associated. So, like, the one on the micro or on the short term, it's easier to fund that because we can say, oh, well, with this short-term donation of $10,000, we helped 50 people. And they're like, oh, that's great, like, great impact, good ROI. Yeah, it really is. Well, with that $10,000, we can almost help one person in long term, almost, right? And that's that one person though, they're good, they're out? No, that's just per year. We're gonna need that every year, like that one person, right? So it's like, well, I'd rather help 50. Let's just do that, right? And I get it, like, you know, you're not in this field, you know. I mean, I didn't know this until I got into it. But that's keeping a chronic individual off the street for the whole year. And someone who's dealing with chronic illness and chronic homelessness are the most expensive for our society as well, right? They're going into the ER. We have a lot of our clients who are chronically homeless. The hospitals call them super utilizers. We have some of them going into the ER 50 times plus a year. They use the ER because they are chronically ill. They use the ER as their bed. They use it as their place to go. During COVID, you can imagine why that's a problem. We don't have beds, but we had chronic utilizers that the hospital kept calling us and saying, we need you to take so-and-so. Well, we don't have a place for them. And we understand this is a problem, but they need a place to go too. We're sheltering in place. How do you shelter in place if you don't have a place to live, right? And all of us just, COVID hit in March of 2020, everyone's sheltering in place. And then all of a sudden we've got people out on the streets and we're like, don't get around people and, like, isolate yourself. Okay, that sounds great. So anyway, digging into that.
For our final question, can you all highlight some short-term and long-term goals that you'd like to see accomplished in regards to reducing the number of unhoused people in St. Louis? And then can you highlight some ways that students can assist in accomplishing these goals?
I guess I could start with that. Obviously, our goals are to continue to develop these houses in the community and continue to work towards ways to make them available, and find new opportunities for identifying those types of properties that would work for us. We're starting to get to the point where those convent type buildings are less and less available, and we're starting to see the opportunity that we might have to get into property development ourselves, where we need to buy buildings and do it ourselves rather than rely upon lease types arrangements. So, and then kind of long-term goal is obviously working with the city and county to maybe ease the requirements towards establishing these houses in the community, and that is going to be a monumental uphill battle, but we're committed to try to keep that engaged and keep pressure forward. And obviously, short-term goals is the well-being programs that we talked about, and engagement partnerships, mentoring.
Yeah, I would just add that as far as students getting involved, we've got a sign-in sheet right there. If you want to leave your name, number, phone number, we would appreciate any amount of help anyone can give us.
Like, what kind of help would they be able to get?
Well,
Because they have school.
yeah, yeah, we get that,
So,
but
so when would you need them? Would you, like, one day a week, one afternoon a week?
well, for the what we've done so far for the Covenant Partner program is kind of leaving that up to the person, and it's been the amount of people we've gotten is small, so we appreciate whatever help we can get. But the more consistent we can get, the better, obviously. But a small time commitment once a week, once every 2 weeks would be very helpful. And it also doesn't have to be necessarily the accompaniment partner program. We have other ways to volunteer. We have there's constant need for repairs and transportation, bringing food over, and any number of different things that come up throughout the month that we're asking for volunteer service for. So just having more people to be able to call would definitely.
Tim, tell them what to do.
I mean, there are all kinds of organizations in the city that you can volunteer in. College is an excellent place to create social change. When you get given an assignment in class, being strategic about it so that the fruits of the work, the intellectual labor that I'm doing there is useful to my community, so that I deepen my own understanding of it, that I'm asking questions that helps me see more clearly the situation. And as you go farther in school, being able to shape your project so that they provide real assets to your community partners. Because, what if you can help people find their buildings? You can do that with a cool mapping software, or what if you can help people develop new programs, and you did that by researching best practices. So I say, while you're in school, leverage the fact that you're in school. Past that, like, my short-term goal is, a shelter for everyone who's on the street, and housing for everyone who needs it. And I fucking refuse to put that on any other timeline. That should be everyone's short-term goal now.
Yeah,
Immediately, that we build that now. And so to that end, creating community partners, and building programs and asking the questions that transform what's possible.
just being here. I mean, you're here and you're listening and you're talking about it. Keep talking to other people about it. Let's advocate. Vote for individuals who bring up this issue and don't put it under, under the bushel. Like, we need to bring it out into the light and have these conversations. So, I mean, you all are in school, so, you need to focus on that, but, keep the conversation going in the community, because that will change people's minds. And the worst thing that could ever happen is we stop talking about individuals who are experiencing homelessness, because they need a voice and they need to, it's so easy for us to think of them in the shadows. That can't happen. Thanks.
Thank you.